Hey, Miss Dickerson's class, Mr. Olive's class, Bio 2. This is your next unit. We're going to start a unit on invertebrates. And this is lesson number 1 for invertebrates, the no bones phyla. What makes an invertebrate an invertebrate? A few things make an invertebrate an invertebrate, but one of the things, it's something that's multicellular, so it's made up of more than one eukaryotic cell. The other thing is that it's a heterotroph. So you remember autotrophs are things that make their own food, and heterotrophs are things that eat stuff. Some of the different phylums of invertebrates that you guys might recognize. Cnidaria, these are things like jellyfish, sea anemones, coral polyps, things with little stinging tentacles, round circular bodies. Annelids, these are things like earthworms and leeches, things that have a mouth and an anus. Mollusks, which is everything from the scallop that you see right there, from mussels and clams, oysters, to squid and slugs and snails. And then the biggest phylum on planet Earth is the arthropods, which is everything from beetles and insects to crabs and spiders. So there's also nematodes, which would be little parasitic worms, heartworms that a dog might get in the south, and whipworms and hookworms that humans can get. There's echinoderms. There's porifera. Porifera is a very ancient one. Echinoderm means spiny skin, like a sea star. Anyway, there's others too. Okay, so what's the big purpose, the main thing that we're going to focus on here? We're going to use invertebrates to introduce the idea that some parts of a body are considered more primitive and other parts would be considered more advanced. So when we think back to our evolution unit, why would we consider some animals to be more primitive to the others? And the answer really comes down to this. Which animals have characteristics that more closely resemble humans, and which characteristics are further and further away from humans. So on an evolutionary scale, animals that have characteristics closer to us are considered more advanced, and animals further than us are considered more primitive. All right, first characteristic we're going to look at is body structure. So there's two types of body structures that we're going to talk about. There's a few more, but we're mostly just going to talk about these two, radial and bilateral. The first type is considered more primitive, radial symmetry. And if you look there, radial symmetry, kind of think of the way the sun radiates. It radiates out from the sun, or radial tires, which are round with a hole in the middle. There's no front, no back, just similar body parts that branch out from the middle. So the sea star, the sea anemone both have radial symmetry. The next type of body style, is bilateral symmetry. And this is like you and me. We cut right down the middle. We've got an eye on one side and an eye on the other side, and we're pretty much the same on both sides. So this is a Jerusalem cricket's what I always called this animal. But as you can see, it's got anterior side, that's what's called the front. The posterior, that's going to be the back. The dorsal, that's the top, and the underbelly is the ventral. So all bilateral symmetry animals have that characteristic. It's a little bit different. So bilateral symmetry can be divided along a plane that splits the animal's body into right and left sides that are mirror images of each other. So you had radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry. Here's some examples of invertebrates with radial symmetry, that round body style with a mouth or anus in the middle. Sometimes they have an anus, sometimes they don't. All these cnidarians, the jellyfish, the sea anemone, the Portuguese man of war, those are all radial symmetry, as well as that crown of thorns sea star. And these guys have bilateral symmetry. They've got a couple of eyes on either side, claws on either side. And, anyway, they've just split right down the middle, same on the left as it is on the right. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is as far as what's considered primitive or more advanced, is the way animals take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide, respiration. It's something that animals all do, including invertebrates. Ours is the most souped up advanced version of respiration. And if you look at just our lungs, our circulatory system is very, very high end, the way we take in oxygen and the way we pump our blood. Now, by contrast, this is a more primitive form. It's what's called an open circulatory system. So oxygen isn't breathed in. It just goes into these animals, and the oxygenated fluid is kind of pumped into an open body cavity, and that oxygen is allowed to diffuse throughout the body. In the case of these arthropods here, like this grasshopper, you can see these things called spiracles right here, and oxygen just goes right into the side of its body and spreads throughout an open cavity, oxygenates all the fluid. Carbon dioxide flows out the same way. And this mollusk belongs to the class Bivalva, and oxygen will go in and pump throughout an open circulatory system. So that's an open circulatory system, more primitive. More advanced would be, it's kind of hard to think of an earthworm as advanced, but would be the closed circulatory system of an earthworm, where it has a dorsal vessel, a ventral vessel, and it has a hearts or aortic arches that pump the oxygenated fluid throughout. These are other animals with closed circulatory systems like ours, that they have vessels that move the blood around, hearts in some cases that really move the blood around. Another thing, part of a system that you could look at as being advanced or not advanced would be the digestive tract. So we have a mouth, we have a stomach, and we have an anus. That's very, very advanced. We can go for hours without eating because we have a stomach, a sac that holds our food and allows digestion to take place. Not everything has that. Most things don't have that. That's considered very advanced. So in the case of the most ancient of the invertebrates, the sponge, if food should happen to land on it, what they call marine snow, if food just lands on it, well, then it will digest that food. If it doesn't, it doesn't. This guy here, a planaria, has a thing called a pharynx, and it's just like a straw in its midsection. It lands on silt at the bottom of a swamp and sucks it in through its pharynx, and it goes into a hole, and then boom, it comes right back out the other end. So it doesn't have an anus. It's probably got the worst breath in the animal kingdom because it eats and poops out of the same hole. So that's another example. And then the earthworm's getting closer to us as far as becoming closer and closer to being more advanced. It's got a lot of stuff up front, mouth, and takes things in through a pharynx, and then it's got a thing called a crop and a gizzard that helps it kind of break things down. And then the longer its intestine is, in other words, the longer its body is, the more absorption it can do. Still no stomach. So then you get into some arthropods and things like that. They have a stomach that's more advanced. Sexual reproduction, very, very different all throughout the invertebrate world, but only a few more advanced invertebrates have two genders, have a male and a female gender, like these cuttlefish or like other things. These are arthropods. All of them, they're famously have two genders. If you've ever gone crabbing off the Oregon coast, you have to throw the females back, but you can keep the males, and they're distinguished right here underneath. And then female black widow will eat the male right after they mate, and so will this mantis. So obviously arthropods, two genders. Most invertebrates are hermaphroditic, so they have both male and female parts within. A couple of worms meet after a good rain on the surface, and they'll just simply exchange semen. So they both, and then they'll go off later, and maybe when there's enough leaf litter and stuff to eat, they'll allow it to fertilize their eggs. But they have both seminal vesicles and seminal receptacles. Earthworms do, which means they've got both parts. That's very common in the invertebrates. So, all right, I'm going to get through this real quick. I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and you can pick the level that you want to answer. You can answer the easier questions, the medium questions, or the harder questions. It's up to you. And And let's get through this. If you're in Miss Dickerson's class, she's probably already established with the microbiology unit how she wants to answer in distance learning. With me, I just simply put it on a Google slide and share it with me. So either way. All right, question number 1. Please answer this question. What's your name and what period do you have biology to? All right, question number 2. You've got kind of broke this down like a hot sauce. You've got a mild question, a medium question, and then a hot question. The mild question for question number 2. Invertebrates are all very different, but they have 2 things that you can think of in common. What are 2 things that all invertebrates have in common? There's your mild choice. Your medium choice, name 2 phyla of invertebrate, 1 example common name from each. So you have to think of 2 different phylums of invertebrate that we've talked about so far, and then give me 1 example that would fit under each. That's your medium. Here's your hot. So this is still number 2. You can choose this one. This is the hardest one. Here's 4 numbered photos. Which phylum would each of those belong to? Which phylum would each of those belong to? So you guys can come back to that question. I'm going to move on. You have a little more control over how quickly you go through these slideshows. Okay. All right. Here's question number 3. And we'll start with the mild choice. These echinoderms are called sea urchins. What kind of body symmetry do they have? Option number 2, medium. Give 2 examples of invertebrates with radial symmetry and 2 with bilateral symmetry. And option number 3, explain what features a Maine lobster has that demonstrates why it has bilateral symmetry. What features does a sea anemone have that demonstrate radial symmetry? So you have to kind of be able to describe the body style of each of those 2 and explain why each has the symmetry that it has. All right, question number 4 just is basically, hey, how thorough can you answer this? Can you do it? Here we go. Which part of this crayfish would be the ventral part? Which part would be the dorsal part? The anterior part? The posterior part? So, yeah, see how much of that you can answer. That's question number 4. Question number 5 talks about circulatory system. Question number 5, what type of circulatory system is this? So if you look at that fly, or maybe it's a bee, what type of circulatory system is this? The medium question would be, why is this circulatory system considered primitive compared to ours? And then the hot question, the hard question, why couldn't a human get by with an open circulatory system? Why does ours need to be so advanced in comparison? That's question number 5. There's one more question to this. Last question. Give 1 example of an invertebrate that's digestive system differs from a human, and how so? Or you could answer this question. Explain how invertebrates differ amongst one another when it comes to reproduction. Not all invertebrates reproduce the same way. Last question. What do all invertebrates have in common when it comes to reproduction? One thing's for sure. They all have one thing in common. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of those questions and go through them real quickly one more time. Question number 1, what is your first and last name and what period do you have bio to? Question number 2, invertebrates are all very different, but what are 2 things that they have in common? Or name 2 phyla of an invertebrate, 1 common name for each. And here's the other one that you could have chosen. Here's 4 numbered photos. Which phylum would each belong to? So C star.